Sorry about that. Halloween night, trick-or-treaters, it happens. We're on 66 in the middle of the first column. "What's it mean?" said Jill. "What did the news say?" "There won't be any more programs tonight," said Nat. "There's been a breakdown at the BBC." "Is it the birds?" asked Jill. "Have the birds done it?" "No," said Nat. "It's just that everyone's very busy. And then, of course, they have to get rid of the birds, messing everything up in the towns. Well, we can manage without the wireless for one evening." "I wish we had a gramophone," said Jill. "That would be better than nothing." She had her face turned to the dresser backed against the windows. Try as they did to ignore it, they were all aware of the shuffling, the stabbing, the persistent beating and sweeping of wings. "We'll have supper early," suggested Nat. "Something for a treat. Ask Mammy. Toasted cheese, eh? Something we all like?" He winked and nodded at his wife. He wanted the look of dread, of apprehension, to go from Jill's face. He helped with the supper, whistling, singing, making as much clatter as he could, and it seemed to him that the shuffling and the tapping were not so intense as they had been at first. Presently he went up to the bedrooms and listened, and he no longer heard the jostling for place upon the roof. "They've got reasoning powers," he thought. "They know it's hard to break in there. They'll try elsewhere. They won't waste their time with us." Supper passed without incident, and then, when they were clearing away, they heard a new sound. Droning. A familiar sound they all knew and understood. His wife looked up at him, her face alight. "It's planes," she said. "They're sending out planes after the birds. That's what I said they ought to do all along. That will get them. Isn't that gunfire? Can't you hear guns?" It might be gunfire out at sea. Nat could not tell. Big naval guns might have an effect upon the gulls out at sea, but the gulls were inland now. The guns couldn't shell the shore because of the population. "It's good, isn't it?" said his wife. "To hear the planes?" And Jill, catching her enthusiasm, jumped up and down with Johnny. "The planes will get the birds! The planes will shoot them!" Just then they heard a crash about 2 miles distant, followed by a second, then a third. The droning became more distant, passed away out to sea. "What was that?" asked his wife. "Were they dropping bombs on the birds?" "I don't know," answered Nat. "I don't think so." He did not want to tell her that the sound they had heard was the crashing of aircraft. It was, he had no doubt, a venture on the part of the authorities to send out reconnaissance forces, but they might have known the venture was suicidal. What could aircraft do against birds that flung themselves to death against propeller and fuselage, but hurtled to the ground themselves? This was being tried now, he supposed, over the whole country, and at a cost. Someone high up had lost his head. "Where have the planes gone, Dad?" asked Jill. "Back to base," he said. "Come on now, time to tuck down for bed." It kept his wife occupied, undressing the children before the fire, seeing to the bedding, one thing and another, while he went round the cottage again, making sure that nothing had worked loose. There was no further drone of aircraft, and the naval guns had ceased. "Waste of life and effort," Nat said to himself. "We can't destroy enough of them that way. Cost too heavy. There's always gas. Maybe they'll try spraying with gas. Mustard gas. We'll be warned first, of course, if they do. There's one thing. The best brains of the country will be onto it tonight." Somehow the thought reassured him. He had a picture of scientists, naturalists, technicians, and all those chaps they called the backroom boys, summoned to a council. They'd be working on the problem now. This was not a job for the government, for the chiefs of staff. They would merely carry out the orders of the scientists. They'll have to be ruthless, he thought. Where the trouble's worst, they'll have to risk more lives if they use gas. All the livestock, too, and the soil, all contaminated. As long as everyone doesn't panic, that's the trouble. People panicking, losing their heads. The BBC was right to warn us of that. Upstairs in the bedroom, all was quiet. No further scraping and stabbing at the windows. A lull in battle. Forces regrouping. Wasn't that what they called it in the old wartime bulletins? The wind hadn't dropped, though. He could still hear it roaring in the chimneys, and the sea breaking down on the shore. Then he remembered the tide. The tide would be on the turn. Maybe the lull in battle was because of the tide. There was some law the birds obeyed, and it was all to do with the east wind and the tide. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 8 o'clock. It must have gone high water an hour ago. That explained the lull. The birds attacked with the flood tide. It might not work that way inland, up country, but it seemed as if it was so this way on the coast. He reckoned the time limit in his head. They had 6 hours to go without attack. When the tide turned again, around 1:20 in the morning, the birds would come back. There were 2 things he could do. The first, to rest with his wife and the children, and all of them snatch what sleep they could until the small hours. The second, to go out, see how they were faring at the farm, see if the telephone was still working there, so that they might get news from the exchange. He called softly to his wife, who had just settled the children. She came halfway up the stairs, and he whispered to her. "You're not to go," she said at once. "You're not to go and leave me alone with the children. I can't stand it." Her voice rose hysterically. He hushed her, calmed her. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll wait till morning, and we'll get the wireless bulletin then too at 7. But in the morning, when the tide ebbs again, I'll try for the farm, and they may let us have bread and potatoes and milk too." His mind was busy again, planning against emergency. They would not have milked, of course, this evening. The cows would be standing by the gate, waiting in the yard, with the household inside, battened behind boards, as they were here at the cottage. That is, if they had time to take precautions. He thought of the farmer Trigg smiling at him from the car. There would have been no shooting party, not tonight. The children were asleep. His wife, still clothed, was sitting on her mattress. She watched him, her eyes nervous. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. He shook his head for silence. Softly, stealthily, he opened the back door and looked outside. It was pitch dark. The wind was blowing harder than ever, coming in steady gusts, icy, from the sea. He kicked at the step outside the door. It was heaped with birds. There were dead birds everywhere, under the windows, against the walls. These were the suicides, the divers, the one with broken necks. Wherever he looked, he saw dead birds. No trace of the living. The living had flown seaward with the turn of the tide. The gulls would be riding the seas now, as they had done in the forenoon. In the far distance on the hill, where the tractor had been 2 days before, something was burning. One of the aircraft that had crashed. The fire, fanned by the wind, had set light to a stack. He looked at the bodies of the birds, and he had a notion that if he heaped them, one upon the other, on the windowsills, they would make added protection for the next attack. Not much, perhaps, but something. The bodies would have to be clawed at, pecked, and dragged aside before the living birds could gain purchase to the sills and attack the panes. He set to work in the darkness. It was queer. He hated touching them. The bodies were still warm and bloody. The blood matted their feathers. He felt his stomach turn, but he went on with his work. He noticed grimly that every window pane was shattered. Only the boards had kept the birds from breaking in. He stuffed the cracked panes with the bleeding bodies of the birds. When he had finished, he went back into the cottage. He barricaded the kitchen door, made it doubly secure. He took off his bandages, sticky with the bird's blood, not with his own cuts, and put on fresh plaster. His wife had made him cocoa, and he drank it thirstily. He was very tired. "All right," he said, smiling. "Don't worry. We'll get through." He lay down on his mattress and closed his eyes. He slept at once. He dreamt uneasily because through his dreams there ran a thread of something forgotten, some piece of work neglected that he should have done, some precaution that he had known well but had not taken, and could not put a name to it in his dreams. It was connected in some way with the burning aircraft, and the stack upon the hill. He went on sleeping, though. He did not awake. It was his wife shaking his shoulder that awoke him finally. "They've begun," she sobbed. "They've started this last hour. I can't listen to it any longer alone. There's something smelling bad, too, something burning." Then he remembered. He had forgotten to make up the fire. It was smoldering nearly out. He got up swiftly and lit the lamp. The hammering had started at the windows and the doors, but it was not that he minded now. It was the smell of singed feathers. The smell filled the kitchen. He knew at once what it was. The birds were coming down the chimney, squeezing their way down to the kitchen range. He got sticks and paper and put them on the embers, then reached for the can of paraffin. "Stand back," he shouted to his wife. "We've got to risk this." He threw the paraffin onto the fire. The flame roared up the pipe, and down upon the fire fell the scorched, blackened bodies of the birds. The children woke, crying. "What is it?" said Jill. "What's happened?" Nat had no time to answer. He was raking the bodies from the chimney, clawing them out onto the floor. The flames still roared, and the danger of the chimney catching fire was one he had to take. The flames would send away the living birds from the chimney top. The lower joint was the difficulty, though. This was choked with the smoldering, helpless bodies of the birds caught by fire. He scarcely heard the attack on the windows and the door. Let them beat their wings, break their beaks, lose their lives in the attempt to force an entry into his home. They would not break in. He thanked God he had one of the old cottages with small windows, stout walls. Not like the new council houses. Heaven help them up the lane in the new council houses. "Stop crying," he called to the children. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Stop crying." He went on raking at the burning, smoldering bodies as they fell into the fire. "This'll fetch 'em," he said to himself. "The draft and the flames together. We're all right as long as the chimney doesn't catch. I ought to be shot for this. It's all my fault. Last thing I should have made up the fire. I knew there was something." Amid the scratching and tearing at the window boards came the sudden homely striking of the kitchen clock. 3 a.m. A little more than 4 hours yet to go. He could not be sure of the exact time of high water. He reckoned it would not turn much before 7:30, 20 to 8. "Light up the Primus," he said to the wife. "Make us some tea, and the kids some cocoa. No use sitting around doing nothing." That was the line. Keep her busy, and the children too. Move about, eat, drink, always best to be on the go. He waited by the range. The flames were dying, but no more blackened bodies fell from the chimney. He thrust his poker up as far as it would go and found nothing. It was clear. The chimney was clear. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Come on now, Jill," he said. "Bring me some more sticks. We'll have a good fire going directly." She wouldn't come near him, though. She was staring at the heaped, singed bodies of the birds. "Never mind then," he said. "We'll put those in the passage when I've got the fire steady." The danger of the chimney was over. It could not happen again, not if the fire was kept burning day and night. "I'll have to get more fuel from the farm tomorrow," he thought. "This will never last. I'll manage, though. I can do all that with the ebb and tide. It can be worked, fetching what we need when the tide's turned. We've just got to adapt ourselves, that's all." They drank tea and cocoa and ate slices of bread and Bovril. Only half a loaf left, Nat noticed. Never mind, though. They'd get by. "Stop it," said young Johnny, pointing to the windows with his spoon. "Stop it, you old birds." "That's right," said Nat, smiling. "We don't want the old beggars, do we? Had enough of 'em." They began to cheer when they heard the thud of the suicide birds. "There's another, Dad," cried Jill. "He's done for." "He's had it," said Nat. "There he goes, the blighter." This was the way to face up to it. This was the spirit. If they could keep this up, hang on like this until 7 when the first news bulletin came through, they would not have done too badly. "Give us a cigarette," he said to his wife. "A bit of a smoke will clear away the smell of the scorched feathers." "There's only 2 left in the packet," she said. was going to buy you